Welcome back to Core HTML Mastery. We're going to be talking about images in HTML. As we likely already know, websites make heavy use of images. Wouldn't really be a website without at least a few images to make the page look good and illustrate various concepts. So we're going to add an image to this blank HTML document. Now, first of all, let's check out the directory structure. So we can see we're in index.html at the moment. We have a pages folder where we've been loading up some of the other pages on our website. We also have an images folder. Now, this is just one example of a directory structure. Different websites use different directory structures, but often we'll find our images all in one place. And in this case, they're inside the images folder. We're going to load up this scenery.jpg image. Okay, so the HTML for loading an image, simply make use of an image tag. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind here. First of all, image is a self-closing tag, so we do not need to close the image tag like so. We simply have image. Also, notice this is an abbreviation of image, IMG. At some point, you're probably going to try and use a full image tag. So just keep in mind this is incorrect. It's actually an abbreviated form of image. Now, by default, an image is going to need two attributes. Always at least two. There are other attributes that we can use. We always need a minimum of two attributes when making use of an image tag. The first is the source, and this is the location of where the image is found. It's very similar to the href attribute we use when making use of an anchor tag in HTML. We need to tell a browser where this image resides that we want to load up. So in this case, we know it's inside the images folder, and it's simply called scenery.jpg. We also need, and let's just test this by the way, so you can see it does actually load up the image, but this is bad practice because we're missing the second attribute, and that is the alt attribute. And this specifies some text to be displayed if the image doesn't load. So maybe our source attribute is incorrect, maybe the image is missing, the image doesn't load for whatever reason, we'll see the text instead. The alt attribute is also very useful if someone's using a screen reader. For a visually impaired user, they're not going to see the image necessarily, but they might be able to access the text in the alt attribute. So ideally, the alt attribute should describe what we see in the image. So for example here, an image showing a lake and some mountains. That's wonderfully unspecific. This is obviously a specific location somewhere. You might include that in the alt, but seeing as I don't know where this is, we have an image showing a lake and some mountains. So this is perfectly valid HTML, and just to simulate what would happen, let's just say, for example, that we typo the source attribute. So obviously when the browser looks for images scenery.jpg, it's not going to find it. Let's refresh. So it's not able to find the image, but notice we have the text from the alt attribute being displayed, an image showing a lake and some mountains. Now there's another problem with this image. Well, it might not be a problem, it depends what you're going for, but this is a fairly large image. And that's because it's just rendering at its default size. So if we have an image that is 1,000 pixels wide, well, by default, that image is going to render at 1,000 pixels wide. What if we just wanted a very small version of this particular image, perhaps simply to display alongside some text, for example? We can make use of width and height attributes. So let's set width equals, and we can specify a value in pixels. So if I say width equals 100, let's refresh. You can now see that the height is automatically sized so that the image maintains its aspect ratio. But we could specify both. So we could say height equals, and we could stretch the image in some weird ways. So we could say height equals 300 pixels. So you can see obviously the entire image is being rendered there, but it's now not maintaining its aspect ratio because this image is meant to be wider than it is tall, but the way we've set it up, it's actually taller than it is wide. So we have some extremely tall looking mountains as a result. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind here. First of all, most developers don't use these attributes. The reason is fairly straightforward. This type of thing is usually styled with CSS. So just to give you a very quick example, and we have been making use of some very limited CSS throughout this course. So if we style the image, then we can simply say height, let's say 300 pixels, width 300 pixels. and we can see an image that's being sized according to our specification. But of course, using CSS, we can get more control over the image. For example, if we specify a size that's not natively the size of the image, we can choose whether the image is stretched or whether the image is clipped in order to fit in that changed new aspect ratio. So be aware that you can, as a quick fix, style width and height attributes using HTML itself. But keep in mind, in most cases, you'll probably want to do this with CSS. Another thing to keep in mind here is that when we have a fairly large image file, what's happening is that entire image file needs to be transferred from the website to the user's browser, and then it's resized and displayed on the page. And that's not especially efficient. So good practice is, if you want an image that's 300 pixels by 300 pixels, you actually include an image in your directory that is 300 pixels by 300 pixels. Because generally larger images take up more space. It takes longer for the user to download those images before they can be displayed on the page. So the most efficient thing to do here is not to just simply upload any image, no matter how large, and then resize it after the user has downloaded it in their browser. The best thing to do really here is to actually start off with an image that's the right size. So do the processing on that image outside of building the web page. Then once that image is placed in your file structure on your website, we won't actually need to play around with width or height attributes, either via HTML or via CSS, because that image is already the right size. Something that's very commonly done is to have multiple versions of the same image. So for example, imagine you had a website where users upload a photo library and they have a gallery view where they have a thumbnail view of all of their images. But if they were to click on one of the thumbnail views of their image, then the site loads up the full screen version of that image. Well, rather than just rendering the full screen image in gallery view and then resizing it, on the back end of our site, we'd often store all of those images in thumbnail format and also store all of those same images in their full aspect ratio, their full size. So the idea is, initially for the gallery view, the user just gets the thumbnail version of their image loaded up, and then only if they click on a specific image would we make the browser do the work of downloading the full-sized image. So we are thinking about HTML here, but even as we think about HTML, we want to think about the efficiency of what we're asking the user's browser to download. Because if the user has to download unnecessary amounts of files, it's obviously going to slow down the user experience. So in this case, best thing to do would be to fire up Photoshop or perhaps GIMP photo editor, resize the image so it takes up less space, re-upload it to the directory, and that way we can actually just make use of an image tag without using any CSS and without making use of the height or width attributes on the HTML. In terms of the HTML, you need to know for this, it's actually very straightforward. We just have image. Two key ideas here. We have a source tag that tells us where the image is located. And by the way, you can use a web address here. So if you want to reuse an image that you find on the internet, you can actually use a link to that image here. And then the other thing we need is the alt attribute, which displays text in the case of the image not loading, or in the case of our user being visually impaired, this will actually give them a text description of the image itself. One final thing to keep in mind when using images, not all images are free to use. For example, this image you see right now is a free image. I have the license to use it, but we can't necessarily just grab any image off the internet and use it as part of our website. Certain images are copyrighted and you won't be able to use them without the license. And if you just have a small website, you might get away with this kind of thing. But the problem is, if your website ever grows and someone realizes that you are using an image that you should have a license for that you don't, you could end up in some difficult situations where you're perhaps facing a lawsuit or something similar because you used a copyrighted image. So always make sure to use your own images or images that you specifically have the license to use. Otherwise, you could get in trouble with this. All right, thanks very much for watching. Catch you in the next part of the course.